Good evening, it's Lee Reporter. Welcome to the first section of the Threats and Vulnerabilities class that just began at the beginning of this week. Trying some different time slots and different uh, days even. This is actually a Thursday for this class. Already had one-on-ones with both the students in this class, and I know that we've been getting you up and running with the basic stuff. But let's do a quick recap, and then I'm going to spend some time on particularly lesson 5, sort of a little quick tour and demo. But of course, lesson 1 is mainly about getting the environment set up. We have a GNS3 topology, another variant of our theme that we've played with before throughout this course. We will use it for a couple of the exercises. For exercise lesson 3 in the baselining and auditing lesson, as well as lesson 9 when we return once again to the Damn Vulnerable web app and play with some of the stuff in there. But that's all we'll really use it for, as opposed to it really was such a big piece of net defense and logging and monitoring. In this case, it's only a smaller piece because we also introduced a number of standalone VMs, a Kali Linux VM, as well as some custom built VMs to act as a mail and web server, a victim machine effectively for some demos, and then at the very end that capture the flag VM that we're going to be using as part of lesson 10 and as part of preparing you for your final project to build one yourself. So there is some additional information in lesson 1. Lesson 1 covers, we've talked about threat actors and we've talked about different types of attacks. But as we dive deeper into this class, we wanted to kind of look at that in a couple different ways beyond just sort of the standard definitions, if you will, of say script kiddie versus nation state actor or whatever. But look at them and sort of analyze threats and actors in a little bit more detail. And begin to get you to thinking about it, more than just that sort of monodimensional approach. And that's pretty much what we do. We sort of look at a couple different ways, a couple different models of how you could rank and evaluate threat actors. We also look at kind of a different matrix of how we could rank and assess various threats. And those are actually tied to the lessons, the practice lessons in lesson 1. But the bulk of lesson 1 is really about getting the things set up. And as I've already walked you folks through, but just as a quick recap, you need to make sure you're up to date with your VirtualBox. Get the latest version of the extension pack because that'll be required to run the Kali Linux VM. You'll need to download the topology and import it into GNS3. We've gotten past any of the issues of some of the older appliance images there for everybody, so that should be pretty smooth. And then, of course, over time, as you get into lessons 5 and 6, etc., you'll be instructed to download the standalone virtual machines. And so that's lesson 1. Then lesson 2 is a really important concept, and we've touched on it indirectly, but we really wanted to focus on it here in the Threats and Vulnerabilities class, and it's the concept of indicators of compromise. So what does that mean? Well, I mean, any kind of indication, any kind of sign that something's up, right? And we went through all these courses to learn about all the different things that can be up, how to do some of them, how to defend against them. We understand firewalls and various systems and how they produce, of course, all kinds of logs. And then we learned all about in logging and monitoring the various systems like, security incident and event management, network security management, on, unified threat management systems. So all these different systems that we can use to bring all this data together so we have that situational awareness. So, okay, now you have all the data, you have it all together, you have an idea of your system. So what kind of things might indicate that something's up, especially if it's, despite all that, slipped in under the radar, so to speak? What are the signs? Well, some are pretty obvious. If you get alerts and things from those systems, your intrusion detection is firing off, your logging and monitoring systems are indicating an activity that something's up, then obviously those are some of the more obvious ones and definitely ones to sort of track down and see what's going on. But there are actually a lot of other indicators of compromise when you really get down to it, especially, like I said, if something has slipped under. Like many people, I mean, if you think about it, I have to actually look this number up, but I don't know, but some percentage, just for easy math, let's say it's 10% of the people in the United States. It's probably higher, as sad as that is, but a certain percentage of every computer user out there at any given moment is already infected, whether they know it or not. Some people know it, they've got pop-ups, it's real obvious that things are going wrong. But then other people don't know it because they're part of a zombie network. Their machines are being used to send spam or to carry out other attacks. And as the attackers are getting more sophisticated, they're getting better at not overwhelming the system that they're on, so that it doesn't really, it doesn't do any good for the attacker if they take over a system, infect somebody's machine, if it immediately gets caught and cleaned up and reformatted or whatever, and then they lose it. So they've learned to not just necessarily take every bit of resources on a machine like some of the earlier generations of some of this automatic software. Now they're being smarter, kind of analyzing what they're part of, and then taking extra time and extra resources. But this does give you some indicators. There could be other processes now running on your machine, whether that's through the Control-Alt-Delete and security options on Windows and looking at the task manager, or using a PSAUX command on a Linux machine or even a Mac. You're looking at, hey, there's stuff running that shouldn't, I'm not familiar with this stuff. That could be an indicator of compromise. The fact that things are just running slow, a machine that for no other reason that you can't account for. And of course, we've got to check, maybe a user has installed something else or had some other issue that they put aside. They had some conflict or errors, but they just forgot about that, and then they complain that their machine's running slow. There could be other reasons, of course. We'll have to troubleshoot and sort of figure that out. But it could be an indicator of compromise, that there is these processes, there's something running in the background, and it's using some of our hard drives have filled up all of a sudden for no reason. Then what's going on there? We find strange files on our systems that, hold it, I don't remember there being these files in the temp folder, or these files in the, in the root directory of the system, or the web directory, in the uploads directory, things like that. So all of these different types of things can be what we call indicators of compromise. And there's even a couple case studies, as we've used occasionally throughout the courseware as well, for you to take a look at. And so that's lesson 3. Lesson 2. Lesson 3 is on auditing and baselining. It's one of the things that is, we also wanted to, in our final full class here before the final project, wanted to sort of bring this in under this umbrella, because it's a hugely important concept. As we've now learned about all different kinds of systems, servers, software, Linux, Windows, all kinds of different Macs, whatever, that are going to be there. There's all these different logs. At least in principle, how you can start to bring some of that together for analysis. And so, but if you're just doing that alone, that's cool. It's better than nothing. But and definitely if you get alerts and things, we can react to that. But how do you know, let's just say, okay, we got that all set up, so we bring in all this data every day, day in and after day. Then if it's not such an obvious attack or such an obvious breach that's going on, how do we know? Well, one of the big things that these systems can help us with, and that we do as engineers and security engineers, is we want to baseline the system. That could be a particular machine. That could be a whole network, the whole cloud architecture of our company, whatever, and everything in between. But the idea is we want to baseline things. What does that mean? Well, we want to analyze it, monitor it, log it, capture packets, everything we're maybe doing for a period of time, say on a network segment. And now we have this baseline. This is how we operate. During the day, we're busy. At night, it slows down because people go home, or maybe we have 24 shifts, so it doesn't, whatever. We know what our usage patterns are, right? Now we have this baseline. We've run and gathered this data. We've run some statistics, done some analysis, and we know that on average, we generate so much traffic in and out of our network segment. Our machines take so many accesses and hits. We have so much space on our systems, our servers, whatever. We baseline all these facts. And then periodically, we can do checks against that baseline. So, and that's some of those, those unified systems, logging and monitoring type systems will help do this. You can establish within the software, this is my baseline. And then if it spots deviations from that baseline, then it will warn you, even if it's not directly, something that's firing off an intrusion detection. We're just having a lot more bandwidth today than we usually do on a Thursday at 3, and the system will warn you. And so baselining and auditing is a hugely important part of what we do in security, because it allows us to put that, that base in place. This is our foundational. This is how we operate. This is how this machine works. This is how much data we transmit. This is how much processing we do. This is how much free space we have. This is known. This is our baseline. And then any deviations from that can be indicators of compromise, of course, and be something that we want to monitor and and take action against. Your lesson in the exercise in the lesson actually is to and of course, one of the big things, there is some additional information on auditing at the end, including how it's important for compliance. Many times you may be audited, if you're in certain financial sectors or you're in defense, whatever industries you're in that would require an auditor to come in periodically, then you obviously want to have done your own audits and be able to show that things are in the norms, operating within the norms. And so then as sort of a baselining exercise, at least in principle, it's fairly simple, but it's also a little bit of a review of some of the things that we've used and we wanted to re-emphasize, like the importance of Nmap and different Nmap scans. And in addition to being able to just run scans on a machine like we've done on certain devices and the topology, some of you I know have played with it against your own machines or against random VMs you've created, things like that. So but that's useful. That's a point in time snapshot. Okay, yeah, those ports are open, or these machines are on this segment of the network. But you can also, and you could automate this technically with scripting, like the shell scripting or Python scripting we've covered to the program to date. But you could basically, we can use tools like Nmap and others, of course, to basically help us with baselining. So we can scan an entire segment of a network and then, capture that data in different forms and be able to know, okay, well, within this DMZ or within this LAN or within this office floor or this office building, whatever, we know that when we baselined, when we scanned everything, these were the machines that answered. And we can compare this potentially, say if it's a LAN segment, we could look at the DHCP server's logs and see what IPs it expects, and then scan and make sure we're finding just those machines. Those machines have been assigned an IP, they should be on our LAN. If they're not, then where did these other machines come from? Is this some employee who's just configured it statically? Is there a rogue machine or access point or something on our network? This is the kind of stuff that we can do. And so we can run scans like ping sweeps across the network and basically save that information. And then, of course, we could also do further scans using Nmap or other tools that would allow us to, look at what ports are open, what services are running, etc. Once again, if we save this data and then go back and compare it at a later time, then we are able to use that as an auditing and baselining kind of thing. As a simple exercise, you're going to use, some of the appliances like the Kali Linux appliance, or various appliances, because a lot of them have Nmap. You're going to scan different segments. You're going to capture that data by redirection. So it's a little bit of review of Nmap, a little bit of review of Linux basics, and just a baselining exercise. Lesson 4 is, in effect, one of the least hands-on in the course. It is actually a really in-depth dive into social engineering. Now, in addition to being a really deep dive into social engineering attacks and more information and some great examples and things like that, there's a really good section in this lesson about the motivational techniques, the psychological aspects, if you will, that social engineers are preying upon, like people's need to belong and trust and intimidation and different types of techniques that they're using, and depending upon, the trick in question. And there are some really great examples of cases where these types of social engineering attacks taking advantage of these different psychological aspects. I mean, you think about it, if you get a phishing email that says, hurry, do this, they're trying to get you to take action now, that into, immediacy, you've got to take advantage. It's a great deal. You don't want to pass it up. And of course, if you fall for that grab at your, I got to do this, then of course you might click that link and be getting malware or whatever the case may be. Maybe, some of the scams that are pulled is to pretend you're a higher up in the company or you're IT or something. So you're playing on this authority and maybe even intimidating this person to get the work, get it done. You got to get this done right now. It's important. We're going to lose this huge deal. Cut this check or send this thing or authorize this. And so these are the types of things that add a little more depth to our understanding of social engineering. And it's actually, one of the, arguably the most effective attack. As many things as there are, and as many times as there'll be bugs, and as many times as there are vulnerabilities in software, if you look at many cases of successful attacks, even major breaches, somewhere in the system, maybe it was a fancy schmancy technical attack that got in, and that's the case. But many times, even that was made possible by the social engineering work that was done initially to compromise accounts, to gather information. And so the sort of, as usual, the human is the weakest link. So it's one of the things we really need to understand social engineering so that we understand how it works. If we ever get into the field, say it's being pen testers, we need to be able to use these techniques as part of our testing. And then, of course, if we're more on the blue team side and we're more in security defense, security training, security administration, we're probably going to be part of training our organization so they don't fall for these types of things. There's one really neat little video in there on the social conformity experiment that, if nothing else, for a few chuckles, and I always ask students after they've had a chance to look at it, it's like, do you think you would have done that or not? I honestly think I wouldn't have, but then again, I don't know. So take a look at the video and see if you would have followed the social norm, which is obviously conformity is one of the things that social engineers prey on. So then as we move on, Lesson 5 is one of the first lessons that we introduce the additional virtual machines. And so that's what I want to spend the bulk of the remaining time I'm going to spend tonight on this first part of threats and vulnerabilities. So I'm going to go and do a screen share. And what I'm going to take a look at when I minimize this stuff is Kali Linux. You have played with Kali as a command line only option in the topology. Many of you I know from the one-on-ones and seeing your screen shares and things like that, many of you have already installed your own Kali Linux VMs to play with. And I'm very happy that that's the case, that almost all of the students, by the time we ever get to this class, you've already been playing with it yourself. And of course, we've been using it. We've used Hydra. We've used that Kali Linux command line appliance within the GNS3 topology for different scans and different attacks. And so this, though, is the way Kali, and just out of the box, this is one of the default, you set it up, the VM that you'll be downloading is already set up. Now, the only difference between the one that we provide and the one that Kali provides themselves is that we've customized the networking a little bit. And what it really comes down to is we've set it up kind of like the GNS3 VM, that it has two adapters. One of them is set up on a host-only network so that it can, and I can even show you that when you go up here under the network icon, you'll see that there are an Ethernet 0 and an Ethernet 1, and then there are two different, and actually I'm glad this kind of did this. There's one little thing, and I'll point it out as you play with it more. And this is the version we've made. If you just have a standard Kali and you have one adapter, it's usually on NAT and you're off and running. But we've created two because we want one of them to be host only so it can be part of this little pretend network we've set up of the other virtual machines you'll be using in some of the exercises. And it basically needs also still, though, to have NAT network access and for updates and things like that. And so actually the way it's supposed to be is that Etho 0 should be connected to 1, and then Etho 1 should be connected to 2. And I can even show you if I bring up a terminal. Am I getting it? I think, there we go. Bring up a terminal here and do an if config on this box. We're actually going to see that the IPs are wrong for what I want, actually. So if we look at the, an if config or an IP show, address show, you'll see that it's been given one of the host-only addresses on Windows virtual machine. It's always 192.168.56 dot whatever. And then it's been given this 10.0.15, which is 0.3.15, which is a NAT address. Well, the first address should be host-only, and the second should be NAT, but the connections are wrong. And so what we're seeing is that what I need to do is actually switch this so that, and this is all you have to do to fix it, is just do that. Takes a second, you'll see it reconnects, and then when you look at it again, you'll see that now Etho 0 has got the first connection, and Etho 1 has the second connection. And then if I run this again, we'll see that things have, that instead of getting, well, it didn't update. That's weird. Okay, anyway, I'll have to look at that. Oh, I think I know why. That would have actually fixed it, though, in your guys' case. That's the one we want. I have actually changed this to play with one of your fellow students' capture the flag systems, so I needed to be on a different, so I don't have it. It will actually be set up on a 192, it has its own IP address, but that's the key point there. Sorry, forgot I had changed that address myself to play with the capture the flag system. But nonetheless, It has two interfaces. The first one, Etho0, should be tied to that wireless connection 1, and then the second one should be tied to the wireless connection 2. It will have a fixed IP address on this little dummy IP that way it can see the other machines that have already been set up, and you'll see that as you get into it. So if you start to work on some of these lessons and run into the situation where you can't seem to ping the other server that's been provided, then double check the Kali and make sure that these are tied 0 to 1 and 1 to 2. Okay, so all right, so Kali, which is given a little bit of a tour in this lesson as well, is a GUI distribution based on Debian, and it comes with just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tools. We can't cover them all. We take you through a high level. We run you through all the different menus. I like to point out a few tricks. Like when you look at this, of course, you're going to find that certain things show up more than once. So one of the things we're going to talk about today is this one, Social Engineering Toolkit. It shows up under Exploitation Tools or Social Engineering Tools. But you'll also notice that a lot of these menus have this little triangle out to the side, which isn't just telling you that stuff's over here, because that one does too. It doesn't have one and it has stuff. But what it really is telling you is you can click and there's all kinds of other stuff. Submenus under subcategories. So as you can see, there are hundreds of tools. Now, despite the fact that there are hundreds of tools in this nice GUI menu, to be honest and straight up, the vast majority of the tools in this suite are actually command line tools. And that's just the world. That's why we taught this program so early on, focusing on Linux and the command line and not letting you do a whole lot of things at a GUI level, because there's not a lot, even when you get into Kali Linux. And we're going to see right now. Let me start up Social Engineering Toolkit. What does it do? It brings up a terminal. Now, this happens to be a menu-driven terminal program. You can see it intro coming, and then here's the menu. But it's a command line program. I may have to type numbers, but I still have to type things. It's not a menu, not a GUI, not a graphical user interface program. Out of all the tools on this thing, there are a number. There's a copy of Firefox on here, obviously, so we can go check out things as part of looking for information. The Metasploit framework, if you fire it up, it brings up a GUI. I mean, not a GUI, it's a command line version. The GUI is their actual paid commercial product. And then Burp Suite is a GUI program, and Montego and a few of the others actually are, but very few of them are. Most of the tools on this whole menu system, well, there are some exceptions, like we have Nmap, but we'll also find that I believe they have ZenMap on this thing too. And if not, you could add it. But of course, Wireshark's GUI, we know Wireshark, so there's a Wireshark on this machine. So there are some GUI tools, but the vast majority of stuff that comes, and you can almost tell as you get down, like most of these don't have fancy icons, and even half the ones that do are, once again, GUI tools. And so you've got all these different categories. Most of the time they'll bring up a command prompt and you'll start working away. So the one we're really talking about today is an overview of the Social Engineering Toolkit, which is a slick menu-driven command line program. And as you can see, it starts off with 6 choices, really, and only a few of those really matter to you. Really, number 1 is the main place you're going to go. There are third-party modules. We don't cover that. There's the pen testing fast track. We don't cover that part of it in this course either. If you update it, it's going to throw an error and say, like right now, you can see the current version is 7.7.4. They're telling you our version is 7.7.4. The current version is 7.7.9. So please update. But if you run this command, it'll actually come back and say, oh, you're running Kali, update through Kali. And then you're back at the menu. And so, of course, then you could do some configuration stuff if need be. One place that might be, if you were really using it in the field someplace, it's defaulting to using Gmail or any open server you might have as a relay. You'll see this in the lesson 6. Next week we'll go over some of that stuff as well. But you can configure it to work with other email packages or other servers as well. And of course, the 99 there for exit is actually exit at this screen, but at other screens it's basically go back. So you can keep hitting that, entering 99 enough times and it'll quit the program. If I could type today, it would quit the program. But let's go into one, take a look. So look at all the things this thing can do: spear phishing attacks, website attacks, infectious media generator. We can this program, and it works with Metasploit, by the way, in the background. for a number of its things, to generate payloads, to create listeners, things like that. But this program, you can literally create like a custom payload. You could create, a tool that would allow you to like send your friend, I guess, or send yourself if you could get it past your own antivirus. You would be able to send, a payload that if that person ran it, it would open up a backdoor on their machine, or if you ran it yourself. And so, of course, the reality is that just the default payloads of social engineering and Metasploit generally don't get past a currently updated machine. I did a lot of playing with even the most recent, as we were preparing this course and building this program over the last over the last year. And so I created my own Windows test machine just to play with it. And if it's a fairly current Windows 10 machine with even just the default Windows stuff, it's going to find the default meta interpreter and backdoors, unless you do other things. And there are other techniques as we go on into your field in future, and as we potentially add into additional courses on this program, where we'll get into stuff like that. But there are ways to go in and mask and try to do some things to get past antivirus and other types of things. But in principle, we can create payloads, we can do mass mailers, which of course would be phishing campaigns. And we'll actually use that mass mailer module because if you go into it, first thing it asks you is, do you want to do a single? So it's mass mailer, but it'll send one, which means it'll send a spearfish. And we're actually going to use that module. So I can back up. The Arduino-based vector attacks are the Arduino, however, I may not be pronouncing that right, but it's a really neat open source project of being able to make sort of almost like Raspberry Pi type of systems, embedded systems, USB devices, all kinds of cool things. And these then can be used to hold malware, make a USB drop stick, make a device that you could best, maybe it's a little small on one board, it has, a wireless emitter, wireless antenna, and you basically drop it at your target and hope that some of the folks on that company might jump on your hotspot instead of the one at the company. And that way you can gather information. We obviously have wireless attack access point types of vectors, QR code, PowerShell vectors. We covered some PowerShell and system administration. Remember, that's the programming and automation scripting language behind Windows these days. And then, of course, SMS, that's becoming more and more common. Of course, that spoofs and scams are happening on the smartphones now, not just through text messaging, basically. And then, of course, like most of the things, it's actually kind of one of the things that's kind of cool. And if you need certain tools, there are lots of these tools. Just like Kali is a collection of tools, and then it itself, one of the stars is Metasploit framework. It itself has all kinds of modules that people have added to it, and you can add additional ones and create your own. The same thing here. You can add additional ones or theoretically create your own modules. And so if we look at some of the things that this program can do, like if we go into the spear phishing, we can perform a mass email attack, we can create a file format payload, we can create a social engineering toolkit. What we're going to do, and I'm just going to give you a high level of it, is that you can, what we're going to do in lesson 6 is you'll use the Kali Linux VM, and you'll use 2 other provided VMs, the net server and the dev client. And the dev client really hosts our victim user who has the Kmail email package. And you're going to use the social engineering toolkit to create a targeted spearfish email at this victim user, attempting to get them to visit your fake version of the company website so that you can capture their credentials. And so you will produce the sort of scenario, and at least in my mind when it was being designed, was that this is an attacker that's doing this over the evening. So they send the email off, the email will be waiting for that person in the morning, and then they set up they clone that company's website, they set up their own clone copy, which we'll just do on Kali Linux, and then set up the listener. And then, of course, when you switch over to the other VM and you receive that email, you click on the link, and the next thing you know, you're at a site that looks just like the real site. And what's wild is actually that they already have in Social Engineering Toolkit, if you don't have a target, like we supposedly have this test.test company with a very simple little login page website, but if we wanted to there's already templates for things like Google and Facebook and Twitter already in there. and you can just have that. So if you could somehow, maybe it's a mass phishing campaign, you get somebody, you send them saying that their Twitter password's been needs to be reset or whatever, and you, of course, in the linked body of the email, it says twitter.com, but if you hide the IP and the real address you're trying to use when you send it in the code, and if somebody doesn't pay attention when they click on it, then they come to what looks like a real Twitter account, they log in, and then it throws some error and takes you back over to the real Twitter. But of course, the runner of that software, that social engineering attack has now captured your Twitter credentials, right? So we're going to basically simulate that exercise next week in lesson 6. I will probably not super demo it because it's pretty straightforward to work through. I probably will work on some of the other ones, talking about metasploitable and as well as the exposure to the capture the flag system, because I think that's probably more important as we go into the final project. So the lesson 5 is really all about getting that first VM set up and running, getting yourself familiarized. And I know most of you already have been playing, so you're familiar at least with the front end, the GUI of Kali Linux. And so then you'll take a nice tour, play around. I really encourage you to obviously do the exercise, stuff like that, but try playing with some of this stuff. Go through the choices like you saw there to create a payload and see what it does. Now there is one thing, and I really should have shown that actually, so I will go back to this real fast. My bad. One of the things that you will find, and I'm going to do this, I'm going to go over to well actually I'm just going to open another window right here on the same page. It's a little overlapping, but okay, so we've got set running here, but then we've now got another terminal. So if I take a look in mine, I'm doing the ls-la because I want to see the hidden files, the ones that begin with a dot, because we're going to see a really critical folder. It's talked about both in the next couple lessons, but I always like to point it out in these videos. I almost forgot, because this is where set social engineering toolkit does its work. So if we switch into that folder and then take a listing inside of here, right now we don't have much but this version going on because it's running. So I'm not going to go through it all. Well, I guess anyway, we'll go through it. We're going to create a payload. So we're going to go into 4. We're just going to do an easy one, reverse shell, number 1. There's meta interpreter, all these different shells we could potentially use. So what's the IP address of the listener? Well, that would be our IP. In the class, it's 192.168.13.13. But of course, I've changed mine, like I said, to use this to play with a different one. But we'll just use what it should be for this machine. Now, normally, of course, what would happen, we're doing it all in one instance, but many real attackers or even pen testers would use the software, and they would set this stuff up. They would build their payload. They would generate this exe, but they would set up a listener on another machine. Like they may have very well compromised another machine. If it's an attacker, use that machine to be the one that's going to be waiting for this to happen. Send it from a completely different machine, and then of course be coming in through proxies to hide so that nobody. That way you can't just trace it back to that attacker. That's a script kiddie there who downloads Kali, uses their own IP address and sends out some stuff, because that traces right back to their house, right, or to their company or wherever they're at. So a real pen tester or a real hacker is going to use multiple. They're not just going to do it all usually on one machine, and definitely not one machine that traces to them. They're going to have compromised the machine and installed this stuff. They're going to have spun up a VM somewhere else under somebody else's account. They're going to have compromised dozens of machines and have the emails come from some, have listeners running on some, commanding, etc. But to simplify and show you how this works, so then the port we're going to listen to, what the heck, we'll just listen on 80, and it's going to generate this. Now, if I come back over here while it's busy generating, and look, now we'll see stuff's happening. We have a payload.exe in this .set folder off our home, off the user's home. If you weren't operating like Kali does as root, then you would be in your own home directory, and it would be a .set folder there. Now, this is literally generating, and this is using Metasploit in the background. It's generating a exe. This exe, if run by somebody, and gets through all the security, and the user says accept it or whatever, then it would open up this reverse shell that we would then connect, and we would have ourselves a command prompt. And like right now, it's asking, do you want me to start the listener? Well, I'm not going to run and infect my own machine and show you, but if we wanted to, we would tell it yes, and then it would launch Metasploit,
and there would be a listener waiting on that port to wait for a connection from our helpless victim who ran that program once we got it on, got it to their machine. So of course, we wouldn't send it as payload.exe. And when we look at it now after it's finished, we can see that it's 73K, 73,000 bytes. And it's payload.exe. That would, of course, trigger all kinds of things. So we would want to obfuscate the name. We would want to do tricks to change it, maybe make it look like an image or a movie or maybe a PDF or whatever it is we're trying to do to slip it past antivirus and get the user to run it and execute it. Is it a case of pretending that this is an important invoice? Is this an important file I need to reset their password? This is an update they need to apply, whatever. We would have to figure out the rest of that attack structure. Now, the one thing I wanted to say, though, and point out, like beyond just that this set folder exists, .set folder exists, and this is where set does the work. But, so we're going to tell it we don't want the listener, and we're going to return to the menu. And so if we come back over here, and oops, I didn't mean to do that. There we go. Come back over here and look, still taking an ls, we see it's still there. But if I go off and start trying to do another campaign, I want to perform a mass mail, and it's giving me all kinds of choices. What I'm going to find is that at some point, it hadn't happened yet, but at some point what will happen, darn, I keep doing Alt-Tab, sorry, is that all the stuff in here is going to get wiped out as I start to build the new thing. So I'm just going to pick one. I'm not even sure. I still want it to be a backdoor. We'll pick whatever address the defaults, let it do it. And now it says waiting for payload to be generated. Well, if we waiting for payload generation, it's going to take a bit. If we come back over here, now we're going to find that it's going to overwrite that one at some point. It's taking a little longer than I expected it to wipe the other one out, but it's working in memory. But same thing happens with our exercise in 6. If you create this template of the site and you create your email, that's why we do it in the order we do it. Actually, we send the email first. That way it creates the email and everything else. And then we create the credential harvester, and we even have to go into the actual set files and make one change to the file that it generates for us. So anyway, I wanted you to be aware of the, I'm just checking again to see if it's updated. It's thinking hard here. Hasn't seemed to overwrite that one yet, but it ultimately will. And so much more verbose messaging on this module than the last one, right? The other one just said, wait, we're generating it. This one keeps saying it over and over. But you get the idea. So set can make payloads that you could send as attachments. It can set up credential harvesting. It can set up, and it can do basically all the pieces you would need of an effective spear phishing or phishing campaign. So you could, generate the email template and send it to a bunch of people. That could include adding an attachment like a payload. It also could be that it's got a fake link in there that comes back to a site that you've set up to capture, their credentials, etc. I'm not going to worry about letting this finish. My point being is that you got to do things in order. And like if you had made a payload, then you would want to copy it out to say to your desktop or to your whatever you've created project folders. This is a client 1. I'm going to do a pen test. I would make a particular payload to try to get into their machines. And I want to go ahead and save that off, and then I can do other work on it, obfuscate it, rename it, make it look like, change its icon, do things like that to get it ready to send to the target. And that way I can go on and do other things. And once they finish, they'll overwrite that stuff. But the set it only keeps sort of one thing in its working folder, at least by default. There may be other ways to configure it. And you could run it as multiple users. That would be one possibility. But really the thing is just remember that the .set folder is in your home directory, and that's where it does its work. So once it's generated you an email template, or once it's generated you a site, once it's generated you a payload, you may need to save these off to reuse at later times. So anyway, I'm going to let that do its own thing as we finish up. And that's all I have for you. Next week, we will cover, of course, the last 5 lessons. This includes the spear phishing lesson I've just described, working with the social engineering toolkit and the other 2 provided virtual machines. Lesson 7 is if we dove deep in the beginning on threats and vulnerability, we dive a little deeper on our threats, and we dive a little deeper on vulnerabilities. And the only lesson that's kind of more conceptual in the last 5. And then we kind of
wrap up strong with a lot of hands-on work. In lesson 8, we will use the Kali Linux VM and then a copy of Metasploitable. We already have been playing with Metasploitable 2. It's in our GSM3 topology, but because of the way that we built that, it's a Docker appliance. It actually is using, and we wanted it to use the same one as the other appliances to keep the size down as much as possible. It's actually using a newer version of Ubuntu underneath, which means some of the exploits that are available in Metasploitable don't actually work in the version that's in the topology. And that's because they depend on kernel, bugs and things that aren't there in that new version. This version that's provided is the default full version of Metasploitable with an old version of Linux, an old kernel. And so everything works. And it's actually one of my favorite exercises throughout the whole program, because it's a lot of the things in Metasploitable are fairly quick. You do this and you're in. You do this and you're in. You do it like a step or two and you're in. And they're not really that complex. And while they do teach you about different types of vulnerabilities and how you could do some of these things, they're also not common in the wild. You're not going to get hired as a pen tester and go find the VSFTP backdoor on any live machines anywhere, at least that I can imagine anymore. I mean, that was only in the wild for so long. And some of the other vulnerabilities, while they may have lasted longer, aren't, there are newer vulnerable systems, newer vulnerabilities, and it's a good learning experience, but many of them are very simple. And so even the VSFTP at least requires a few steps. You got to log into one thing, which fires off the back door, then you connect back. So there's a few steps in there, as opposed to some of them are 1 or 2 steps and you have root. This one that we do in lesson 8 is using the network file system bug that I really like. And it actually ties way back to Network Foundations, where we showed you how to set up the ability to connect into a server, an Ubuntu VM. And this is the way it's done in the cloud these days, is using public-private keys, right? And so basically, you're going to take advantage of a bug in the NFS file system and a bad configuration of exporting that they're sharing the whole system, basically, to be able to update the root user's key file so that you can add your own key so that you can get in as the root user. It's a little bit more complex example of sort of chaining a couple different exploits in a sense together, which is more common than just a boom, boom, you're in. And I think it's a real fun one for you, but it'll be done. And you won't need the dev server. You won't need the victim, dev client. Those can be shut down. That's sort of the most intensive one is either the topology stuff, because we know the GNS3 stuff is pretty heavy, or the lesson 6 on spear phishing, because we use 3 VMs, the Kali Linux, the mail server, web server, and then the victim machine to make it all work. And then of course, but then the rest of the exercises, lesson 8, we just use 2, Kali and Metasploitable, and then 9, we go back to the topology real quick. And then we also then look at using Kali and one of the capture the flag systems. So that's what we'll talk about next week. Have an office hour coming up in about 15 minutes if anybody needs any help. And I'll get this posted as soon as I can. Thanks.